The encounter. Officer Ryan Steele sat in his patrol car, the low hum of the engine filling the silence around him as he gazed out at the neglected streets of South Maple District. This neighborhood, a cluster of old, peeling buildings and dimly lit streets, had been a place he'd come to loathe over the years. To him, this was a forgotten part of the city, filled with people he believed were content with their lot in life, content to live in the decaying shadows of the city's outskirts. He was here every week, circling the same blocks, responding to the same calls. The lack of excitement gnawed at him, and his fingers tapped rhythmically on the steering wheel as he watched the seconds tick by. In his mind, this was a place devoid of ambition, where he was met with blank stares and mumbled responses, the residents always too busy or too tired to try to improve their situation. He'd long since given up expecting anything different. To him, this part of town was a breeding ground for trouble that seemed oddly quiet tonight. As he cruised down Maple Street, the faint glow of a corner store sign illuminated a figure standing just outside. The lone black woman, elderly and dressed in an oversized coat, leaned heavily on a cane. She clutched a plastic grocery bag in her other hand, its contents hidden within. The sight unsettled Ryan. It was past midnight. She shouldn't be out here, not in this neighborhood, not at this hour. To him, she was out of place, a piece in the wrong puzzle, a mystery he felt compelled to solve. "What's she doing out here?" he muttered, squinting through the dim light. To him, she looked too calm, too unaffected by the time or the setting. He watched her as she shifted her weight from one leg to the other, glancing up occasionally, her eyes hidden beneath the brim of an old, wide-brimmed hat. Ryan's gut told him something was off. Perhaps it was instinct, or perhaps it was years of policing mixed with a potent bias he barely recognized in himself. He felt justified, his sense of authority growing by the second. Without a second thought, he steered the patrol car to a stop across the street and killed the engine. Stepping out, he adjusted his belt, his fingers brushing over his badge, a symbol of power he held close. His boots thudded against the pavement as he crossed the street, each step slow and deliberate, a reminder to those watching that he was in control. "Hey," he called out as he approached, his voice breaking the silence. The woman turned her head slowly, not startled, merely aware. Her gaze settled on him, a calmness in her eyes that made him uneasy. She stood still, unfazed by his approach. "What are you doing out here?" Ryan demanded, his tone rough, as if he were barking orders at a cadet. He expected her to shrink, to explain herself quickly. But the woman, standing small but steadfast, simply blinked, her expression unreadable. She didn't answer right away, only tilted her head slightly, looking at him as though she were sizing him up, and then finally said, "Just on my way home, officer." Her voice was soft, almost gentle, yet carried a quiet strength that Ryan couldn't ignore. Ryan clenched his jaw. There was something about her calm demeanor that rattled him. Most people he approached in situations like these were quick to speak, eager to prove they weren't a threat. But this woman seemed to meet his authority with an air of patience, as if his presence neither surprised nor intimidated her. "Home," he scoffed, glancing at her bag. "What's in the bag?" he pressed, narrowing his eyes as he leaned closer. He half expected her to refuse, or perhaps to get defensive, but instead, she met his question with the same calm response. "Groceries," she replied, lifting the bag a little, revealing a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and some canned goods. Nothing more than dinner for the week. She paused, as if giving him time to take in the simplicity of it. For a moment, Ryan's frustration faltered. He saw nothing dangerous, no weapon, no signs of suspicious behavior. But still, he felt an urge to press further, to assert his position. The lack of fear in her eyes, the way she held her ground, it was something he wasn't used to, especially in this neighborhood, especially at this hour. "Got any ID?" he asked, his voice sterner now, a veiled challenge. The woman held his gaze, her calmness unbroken, as she reached into her coat pocket. She pulled out a worn wallet, flipping it open to show a simple ID card with her name, Lillian Warren. She handed it to him, watching as he took it, his fingers brushing over the worn edges as he inspected it with a practiced eye. "Just trying to get home, Officer Steele," she said, her tone even, unthreatening. But the way she used his name caught him off guard. Most people didn't remember his name badge, and fewer still would address him with such calm assertiveness. He scowled, returning her ID. "You shouldn't be out here this late. There's all sorts of people looking for trouble." The word tongued between them, a veiled warning, though he knew he was the only one looking for trouble tonight. She nodded slowly, not agreeing but acknowledging. "I'm aware, officer," she replied. "But I've lived here longer than you've worn that uniform. I can handle myself." The implication stung. Ryan's hand twitched as he considered what to do next. He was used to compliance, to people backing down under his authority. But this woman was different. Her quiet defiance, her dignity, it made him feel small, exposed even. And he didn't like that. "Just watch yourself," he finally said, though the words felt hollow, as if they were meant for him rather than her. She nodded again, and without another word, she turned, hobbling slowly down the sidewalk, her cane tapping softly against the concrete. He watched her go, his frustration simmering beneath his calm facade, a frustration he couldn't fully understand. As she disappeared around the corner, a thought nagged at him, one he couldn't quite shake. He hadn't intimidated her. Not really. And that made him feel powerless in a way he hadn't felt in years. The confrontation. Ryan's gaze lingered down the street long after the old woman had disappeared. Despite her calm words and harmless bag of groceries, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling she'd left in him. The usual sense of control, the subtle power he held over people like her, had been missing. Frustration settled deep in his chest. Who did she think she was, to stand there calmly, challenging him with nothing but her silence and patience? Determined to regain his sense of authority, Ryan decided to circle the block, his headlights casting long shadows against the cracked pavement and litter-strewn sidewalks. He didn't expect her to be lingering around, but if she was, he'd make sure she understood her place. To his surprise, as he rounded the corner, he caught sight of her again. She hadn't made it far, likely slowed by her cane and tired from a long day. She was walking slowly, head held high, her worn coat flapping slightly in the cool night breeze. Her back was straight, her steps measured. She had an air of dignity, one that didn't belong in a place like this, or at least that's what Ryan thought. As he brought the car to a crawl, he could feel his irritation building. Something in him wouldn't let this encounter end here. Flicking his lights on, he rolled to a stop and stepped out, boots crunching against broken glass on the sidewalk. He could feel the eyes of onlookers from darkened windows and narrow alleyways. This time, he wanted her to feel his presence, to recognize that he wasn't someone to be brushed aside. "Hey, you," he called out sharply, the authority in his voice unmistakable. Mrs. Warren paused mid-step, slowly turning to face him with that same unflappable calmness. The street was empty, save for a few distant figures casting furtive glances from nearby porches and doorways, their curiosity piqued by the sudden commotion. Ryan strode toward her, each step an attempt to reassert control. She watched him approach, her face expressionless, neither afraid nor defensive, merely patient. "Didn't I already ask what you were doing out here?" he demanded, the edge in his voice sharper this time. "You don't belong out here at this hour, loitering around like some." He paused, letting the implication hang, hoping to see some reaction. A flinch, a frown, anything. But she merely raised an eyebrow, her gaze steady. "I don't believe I need your permission to walk home, Officer Steele," she replied, her voice as calm and composed as before. The sound of his name on her lips again sent a shiver through him, a reminder that she wasn't intimidated. She hadn't even flinched. Ryan took a step closer, his body blocking her path, leaning in so she would have to look up at him. "You're acting suspicious," he said, emphasizing each word. "An old woman, alone, in this neighborhood, at this hour, doesn't add up." Mrs. Warren tilted her head slightly, her lips curling into the faintest hint of a smile, as though she found his words amusing. "Suspicious," she echoed softly. "I was under the impression that being elderly and walking home with groceries wasn't a crime." Ryan's jaw tightened. He could feel his patience slipping, his grip on control loosening. He wanted her to feel uncomfortable, to acknowledge his power. He was the one with the badge, the one who enforced order in places like this, and she wasn't showing him the respect he felt he deserved. "Look," he said, his voice low and controlled. "Maybe you're not getting it. This is a dangerous area. People like you shouldn't be wandering around at night. It's for your own safety." The faint smile never left her face, but her gaze grew sharper, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "People like me?" she asked, her tone laced with an unmistakable note of challenge. "Do you mean people with darker skin, or people who have a little more life experience than you?" A few passers-by had stopped, lingering at the edge of the scene. Their quiet presence heightened Ryan's frustration. He could feel the weight of their stares, judging him, questioning his intentions. He wasn't used to having his authority questioned, especially not in public. "I don't like your attitude," he muttered, his tone more for himself than for her. He knew the line he was towing, the silent power he held in this moment, and for a flickering second he considered turning and walking away. But his ego refused to let this woman get the best of him. As if sensing his thoughts, Mrs. Warren took a small step back, her hand tightening on her cane. "Officer Steele, is there something more you need from me?" she asked, her voice calm, her words cutting through the tension like a knife. "Or have I satisfied your suspicions?" Ryan's pride flared, a mixture of anger and embarrassment settling in his chest. "Show me what's in your bag," he ordered abruptly, his voice dropping lower. He gestured toward her plastic grocery bag, as though expecting to find something incriminating, something that would justify his suspicion. For the first time, a hint of weariness flickered across her face, but she complied, lifting the bag slowly to reveal its contents. Bread, milk, a can of beans. Nothing more, nothing less. The simplicity of it infuriated him, made him feel small and foolish. "That's all you're carrying?" he snapped, his voice dripping with disbelief, even as he struggled to mask his growing discomfort. Mrs. Warren looked him squarely in the eye. "Yes, officer, that's all." A silence fell between them, thick and heavy. Ryan knew that he should let her go, should let her continue her walk home. But something about her calm defiance, her unwavering gaze, made him feel as though he was the one under scrutiny, as if she were seeing right through him. His grip on his authority was slipping, his composure unraveling. Driven by an urge he couldn't fully understand, he took a final step forward, reaching out to grab her arm, the thin material of her coat bunching under his fingers. He didn't yank her, but his hold was firm, his intent unmistakable. A quiet gasp rippled through the few onlookers gathered, their murmurs cutting through the still night air. Mrs. Warren's gaze shifted to his hand, her expression finally darkening. "Unhand me," she said quietly, her voice laced with a steel that caught him off guard. Ryan hesitated, but his pride wouldn't let him release her. He was determined to see this encounter through, no matter the cost. But before he could react further, a voice cut through the air, loud and commanding. "Officer Steele, what do you think you're doing?" Ryan froze, glancing over his shoulder to see a tall figure approaching from the shadows. His heart sank as he recognized the silhouette. Officer Jackson, one of the most respected members of the force. Known for his fairness and dedication, Jackson was the kind of cop who took his role seriously, never allowing his badge to dictate power. "Let her go," Jackson said firmly, his gaze hardening as he met Ryan's. There was no room for negotiation in his tone, no hint of patience. Reluctantly, Ryan released Mrs. Warren's arm, his fingers tingling with the remnants of his hold. He felt Jackson's gaze shift between him and Mrs. Warren, assessing the situation with a keen eye. "Are you all right, ma'am?" Jackson asked, turning to Mrs. Warren, his voice softening. She nodded, brushing off her coat as though to erase Ryan's touch, but her gaze never left Ryan's, holding him in place, unflinching. "I'll be fine, thank you," she replied, her voice calm yet tinged with the slightest edge of anger. She took a step back, but the power in her stance remained, a silent reminder that she had withstood more than just this moment. Ryan watched, anger and embarrassment simmering as Jackson exchanged a few quiet words with her. His pride had taken a hit, and he could feel his control slipping away entirely. This encounter was over, but the repercussions of his actions had only just begun. As Mrs. Warren walked away with Jackson by her side, Ryan felt the weight of his actions settling on his shoulders, a heavy reminder that authority, when misused, could become a burden. But it was a lesson he wasn't ready to learn. Not yet. Revelations and retaliation. The morning sun filtered through the blinds in Officer Ryan Steele's apartment, casting harsh lines across his face as he blinked awake. The events of the night replayed in his mind like a broken record. Mrs. Lillian Warren's calm defiance, her quiet resilience, and worst of all, the intervention of Officer Jackson. It was all wrong. He could still feel the weight of Jackson's disapproval, that piercing look that suggested Ryan had overstepped far beyond his authority. He grumbled under his breath as he got dressed, his thoughts tangled with frustration. How could Jackson, of all people, take her side? It felt like a betrayal, as though the respect he built within the force meant nothing. As he slipped on his badge, he couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that he'd somehow lost control, not just of the situation, but of his own narrative. And there was nothing he despised more than feeling powerless. Down at the precinct, things were even stranger. A few of his fellow officers were quieter than usual, casting him wary glances as he walked past. He brushed it off, chalking it up to his own paranoia, until he noticed that Officer Jackson was talking with Captain Reyes, his face grim as he gestured toward Ryan's direction. Ryan's stomach tightened. Jackson was a respected figure within the precinct, a mentor to some, and his word carried weight. For a moment, a sliver of fear wormed its way into Ryan's thoughts. Could Jackson have reported him? Surely not. They were supposed to have each other's backs, right? But his fears were confirmed when Captain Reyes called him into her office that afternoon. She sat behind her desk, her eyes hard, scrutinizing him as if she could read every thought running through his mind. She gestured for him to sit, her silence almost more unnerving than words. "Officer Steele," she began slowly, folding her hands on her desk. "I received a complaint about an incident that took place last night." Ryan's heart pounded as he fought to keep his expression neutral. "With all due respect, Captain, it was just another routine encounter. Nothing unusual." Captain Rey's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Nothing unusual." She leaned forward, her eyes piercing. "You were seen aggressively detaining an elderly woman, a civilian, who has lived in this neighborhood for decades. Not only that, but it was Officer Jackson who intervened. Why?" Ryan shifted uncomfortably, swallowing hard. She was acting suspicious, Captain. I was just doing my job." Captain Reyes held up a hand, cutting him off. "Doing your job." She let the words hang between them, each syllable laced with disbelief. "This precinct has a reputation to uphold, Steele. We serve and protect, not harass the very people we're sworn to look after. You need to understand the line between suspicion and prejudice, and from what I've seen and heard, you crossed it." Ryan clenched his jaw, his pride flaring. "She was refusing to comply, Captain. I didn't do anything I wouldn't have done with anyone else." "Is that so?" Reyes said, her gaze unrelenting. "Because according to witnesses, and there are several, you didn't just detain her. You escalated the situation without cause, applying unnecessary force." She paused, as though considering her next words carefully. "This woman is no ordinary civilian, Steele. Do you even know who she is?" Confusion flashed across Ryan's face, masking the irritation brewing in his chest. "She didn't exactly introduce herself, Captain. She's just some old lady with an attitude, probably up to no good." Captain Rice shook her head, a faint hint of disappointment crossing her face. "Her name is Mrs. Lillian Warren. She's a retired FBI agent, one who has been deeply involved with community welfare initiatives and even consults on cases with local law enforcement. And she's also the one who's filed a formal complaint against you." The revelation hit Ryan like a punch to the gut. His mind reeled, struggling to connect the image of the frail, elderly woman with the idea of an FBI agent. But as he thought back to her calmness, the strength behind her words, a sense of dread seeped in. He had grossly underestimated her, and it was a mistake that was about to cost him. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as he fought to mask his anxiety. Captain Rice leaned back in her chair, folding her arms as she watched him carefully. "There will be an internal investigation. Officer Jackson's statement, along with witness testimonies, will be reviewed. Until this is resolved, you're suspended from active duty. You'll need to reflect on this, Steele, not just for your career, but for the integrity of this precinct." Ryan's face burned with humiliation. A suspension, a formal complaint. These were things that could stick to him for years, if not the rest of his career. All because of a single encounter, one that had spiraled out of his control. As he left Captain Ray's office, the eyes of his fellow officers seemed to bore into him. He could feel the weight of their judgment, their disappointment, hanging over him like a dark cloud. He wanted to scream, to fight back, but there was nothing he could do. For the first time in years, he felt utterly powerless. That evening, Ryan found himself walking the same streets he patrolled night after night. The sidewalks were empty, the streetlights casting eerie shadows on the broken pavement. He moved with a strange detachment, his mind replaying the events over and over, searching for any way he could have regained control, any moment he could have salvaged his authority. But each memory only served to reinforce one bitter truth. He'd crossed a line, and now he was paying the price. As he walked, he caught sight of a small gathering up ahead. A group of residents gathered in front of a low, dilapidated building. He recognized some of them. They were familiar faces, people he'd encountered over the years. But the difference tonight was the way they looked at him. There was no fear, no deference, only a cold, hard stare. Ryan's fists clenched as he forced himself to walk past them, ignoring the whispers and pointed fingers. But as he passed, one voice cut through the murmurs, a voice filled with quiet defiance. "Thought you'd scare her off, didn't you, Steele? Maybe you should remember that not everyone here's afraid of you." He whipped around, his jaw tight, but the group merely held his gaze, unflinching. The words stung, a reminder that his reputation, his sense of control, was slipping away piece by piece. Later that night, as he lay awake in bed, a different feeling began to creep in, one he couldn't quite place. For the first time, he wondered about Mrs. Warren, who she was beyond that brief encounter, and what stories she carried. He remembered the way she'd looked at him, not with anger, but with a profound sense of disappointment, as if she'd expected more from him. But Ryan shook his head, brushing off the thought. He wasn't ready to admit fault, wasn't ready to acknowledge the deeper implications of his actions. Yet the feeling lingered, gnawing at him, hinting at a truth he wasn't prepared to face. Facing consequences. The suspension weighed heavily on Ryan Steele as he sat alone in his darkened apartment, a half-empty glass of whiskey resting on the table before him. The silence was deafening, punctuated only by the faint sounds of the city outside, sounds he'd usually be patrolling, sounds he thought he controlled. But tonight, they were just noise, a reminder of everything slipping through his fingers. His badge, his job, his reputation, all of it was now hanging in the balance because of one woman who hadn't backed down. The days following his suspension dragged on, each one bringing new updates he wished he could ignore. His phone buzzed continuously with messages from colleagues and former friends, Most were terse and formal, words of sympathy veiling the judgment beneath. Others, harsher and direct, warned him about the video circulating on social media. A grainy recording captured by a bystander showing the way he grabbed Mrs. Warren. The clip didn't show the words exchanged, didn't capture his frustration. It only showed him, looming over an elderly woman, gripping her arm with visible force. It was an image he couldn't escape. Ryan stared at the screen, his hand itching to shut off his phone and throw it across the room. He had spent years building a career, earning respect, or so he thought, only for a single moment to tear it all down. As he scrolled through comments under the video, each one felt like a jab, piercing through the defenses he had so carefully constructed over the years. Abuse of power. Imagine what else this guy does when no one's watching. This woman has more strength in her pinky than he has in his entire career. Each comment stung, but they also stirred a simmering anger within him. He wanted to believe that these people didn't understand, that they'd never known what it was like to police these streets, where everyone seemed like they were hiding something. But deep down, a nagging thought kept creeping in. Had he let his biases, his pride, lead him to this? On the 5th day of his suspension, he was summoned back to the precinct for a meeting with the Internal Review Board. The air was thick with tension as he entered the boardroom, his footsteps echoing in the otherwise silent space. Seated at the long table were his superiors, their faces expressionless, yet their eyes held a severity that Ryan wasn't used to seeing. Officer Jackson sat on the other side of the room, his arms crossed, his gaze steady but distant. The sight of Jackson stung more than any of the glares he'd received from strangers. Jackson had been the closest thing he'd had to a mentor, someone who saw potential in him even when others doubted. And now, because of one mistake, Ryan could feel that bridge burning before his eyes. Captain Reyes cleared her throat, breaking the silence. Officer Steele, thank you for coming in. This review has been opened due to the formal complaint filed by Mrs. Lillian Warren and the footage that has since circulated. We need to discuss not only your actions that night, but also your understanding of your role within this community. Ryan felt his heart pound in his chest. He'd prepared himself for this meeting, rehearsed lines of justification, told himself he was doing his job, that he'd acted out of caution. But sitting here, facing the stoic expressions of his superiors and the silent disappointment of Officer Jackson, those lines felt hollow, empty. Captain, he began, his voice faltering slightly. I was just doing what I thought was necessary. She seemed out of place. In this neighborhood, at that hour, anyone could be a threat. Captain Reyes narrowed her eyes. Anyone could be a threat. Steele, Mrs. Warren is a retired federal agent who has done more for this community in a year than most have in their entire lives. Your actions not only disrespected her, but also damaged the very relationship we're trying to build with these neighborhoods. Do you understand the implications? Ryan swallowed hard, the reality of his actions settling in. He hadn't just misjudged Mrs. Warren. He'd betrayed the trust of the very people he was supposed to protect. In his mind, he'd convinced himself that he was the one maintaining order. But now, for the first time, he saw that his actions had only created more distance, more distrust. Officer Jackson, Rice continued, turning her attention to him. You were there that night. Would you mind sharing your perspective? Ryan instanced, his gaze shifting to Jackson, who remained impassive, his eyes hard and unreadable. Jackson had been his partner on numerous calls, a confidant and even a friend, or so he'd thought. Now that connection felt fragile, a memory that belonged to someone else. Jackson cleared his throat, his voice steady and measured. Captain, I approached the scene because I was in the area. What I witnessed was Officer Steele escalating a situation unnecessarily. Mrs. Warren did not pose a threat, yet Officer Steele continued to push, continued to demand compliance beyond what was reasonable. His words hung in the air, each one a heavy blow. Ryan wanted to argue, wanted to defend himself, but he knew there was little he could say. Jackson had seen him cross the line, had watched as he allowed his frustrations to dictate his actions. After a few more minutes of discussion, the meeting concluded, leaving Ryan alone with Officer Jackson in the hallway. For a moment, they stood in silence, the tension between them thick and unyielding. "Jackson, Ryan began, searching for the right words, but Jackson held up a hand, his face a mixture of disappointment and something else. Pity, perhaps. "Ryan," Jackson said quietly, his voice softer than Ryan had expected. "This job, it's about more than just enforcing rules. It's about understanding the people we serve, not treating everyone like they're guilty just because they look different or don't fit into our ideas of safe." Ryan's shoulders sagged, the weight of Jackson's words pressing down on him. I didn't realize," he mumbled, his pride battling with a growing sense of shame. Jackson shook his head. "That's the problem, Steele. You didn't want to realize. And now you're facing the consequences." As he walked away, Ryan felt a hollowness settle within him, a void that no amount of justification could fill. For the first time, he was forced to confront the reality he created, a reality where his actions had alienated the people he was meant to protect, where his own biases had blinded him to the humanity of those around him. Back at home that evening, Ryan found himself staring at his badge, its gleaming surface reflecting back the man he'd become. He didn't like the image staring back at him. Mrs. Warren's calm eyes flashed through his mind, the quiet strength she'd shown even as he tried to intimidate her. In a moment of frustration, he tossed the badge aside, the metal clattering against the table, echoing in the silence of his apartment. Days passed, and his suspension continued, but something within Ryan had shifted. The anger he once held toward Mrs. Warren had dulled, replaced by a creeping sense of guilt. He'd spent years telling himself that he was the good guy, that his actions were justified. But now he wasn't so sure. One afternoon, he found himself at a community center where Mrs. Warren had once worked, a modest building bustling with people. He'd never visited before, never cared to know the faces and names of those who frequented it. But today, he walked through the doors, feeling out of place, awkward. Inside, a group of children was gathered around a table, listening intently as a volunteer read aloud. Posters lined the walls, showcasing community events, outreach programs, and initiatives that aimed to uplift the neighborhood. It was a world he had dismissed, ignored. As he stood there, uncertain of why he'd come, a volunteer approached him, her expression curious but friendly. "Can I help you?" she asked. For a moment, Ryan hesitated, but then he nodded, his voice softer than usual. "I'm looking for Mrs. Warren. I wanted to apologize." The volunteer's gaze softened. "Mrs. Warren isn't here today. But if you're serious, maybe you can join us for one of our community events. She'll be here next week." As he left the center, Ryan felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. He didn't know if Mrs. Warren would forgive him or if he even deserved it. But for the first time, he was willing to try, to see beyond his own biases, to understand the people he once dismissed. The truth unveiled. Ryan spent the following week in a haze, battling conflicting emotions. He tried to tell himself he didn't need the approval of anyone in that neighborhood. Yet each night, as he lay awake, his mind returned to the image of Mrs. Warren's calm stare, the disappointment in Officer Jackson's eyes, and the harsh silence that filled the precinct after the investigation meeting. Slowly, the bravado he'd clung to for so long was eroding, leaving behind questions he wasn't prepared to answer. As the day of the community event approached, he felt an unusual mix of anxiety and determination. He hadn't attended community functions in the past, preferring to keep his distance from what he considered distractions from the core work of policing. But this time, it felt different. He wanted answers, explanations, perhaps even redemption. The event was held at the same modest community center he'd visited before. Walking inside, Ryan was struck by how alive it felt. Families gathered in clusters, children played and laughed, and volunteers moved among the crowd, distributing food and setting up booths. It was a vibrant world that had been hidden in plain sight. As he scanned the room, he spotted Mrs. Warren near the back, speaking to a small group of residents. She was dressed in a simple navy blue dress and held herself with the same quiet dignity that had unnerved him on the night of their encounter. Ryan felt his throat tighten as he approached, each step filled with the weight of his missteps. Mrs. Warren noticed him approaching, her expression neutral, though her eyes held a glint of recognition. She excused herself from the group and turned to face him, folding her hands in front of her. She said nothing, waiting for him to speak first. "Mrs. Warren," he began, his voice hesitant. I wanted to talk, if that's all right." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Let's step outside," she said calmly. They walked out to the quiet courtyard, away from the chatter and laughter inside. Ryan glanced down, unsure of where to begin. But the weight of his actions pressed on him, and for the first time in his career, he found himself struggling to speak without the shield of his badge. "Mrs. Warren," he said, finally meeting her gaze, "I wanted to apologize for what I did that night. I misjudged you. I made assumptions, and I crossed a line." Mrs. Warren's expression softened slightly, though her posture remained firm. "You crossed more than a line, Officer Steele," she replied, her voice steady, but tinged with disappointment. "You crossed into a place where prejudice dictated your actions. And that's dangerous, especially for someone with the authority you wield." Her words hit harder than he'd anticipated, each one stripping away the defenses he'd built up over the years. "I thought I was protecting the community," he murmured, almost to himself. "But maybe I was just protecting myself from what I didn't want to understand." Mrs. Warren gave him a long, thoughtful look. "Officer Steele, protection isn't just about making arrests or patrolling neighborhoods. It's about understanding the people within them. It's about seeing them as human beings with stories, struggles, and strengths you may not understand." Ryan swallowed, feeling the sting of truth in her words. "I realize that now," he admitted. "I see that I let my own biases cloud my judgment. But I want to change. I want to understand better, to be better." Mrs. Warren nodded slowly. "Acknowledging that is the first step. But change doesn't come from words alone, Officer Steele. It comes from actions." She paused, studying him with a keen gaze. "Do you know why I was out there that night?" Ryan shook his head, guilt settling heavily in his chest. He had never once considered that there might be a purpose behind her presence that night, something deeper than his assumptions of wrongdoing. "I was returning home from a visit with a friend who had just lost her son to violence," Mrs. Warren explained, her voice softening. "This community has seen more loss and hardship than many realize, Officer Steele. I've spent my life trying to build bridges, trying to create a place where people feel safe and understood. But it's people like you, people who wield power without understanding, that often break those bridges down." Her words were a revelation, one that cut through his guilt and left him feeling exposed. He realized then that he had never truly seen the community as anything more than a series of potential threats, of suspects waiting to be apprehended. He had stripped away their humanity, seeing only what he wanted to see. "I want to change that," he said earnestly, his voice barely above a whisper. "If you'll help me. I want to know this community, the people, the stories." Mrs. Warren's gaze softened further, and after a long pause, she nodded. "It won't be easy, Officer Steele. Understanding others requires looking at your own flaws, confronting your own prejudices. But if you're willing, I'll introduce you to the work we do here. You'll meet the people, hear their stories. It's a journey, not one that comes with a badge or a uniform, but one that's lived every day." For the first time in years, Ryan felt a flicker of hope, a sense of purpose that went beyond the confines of his usual duties. He nodded, his heart heavy but resolute. "I'm willing to do the work, Mrs. Warren." They stood in silence for a moment, a quiet understanding passing between them. The air felt lighter, the burden of guilt lifting ever so slightly. Ryan realized that this was the beginning of a journey, a path that would require him to confront not only his actions, but the beliefs that had driven him to that fateful encounter. As they returned to the community center, Mrs. Warren introduced him to several volunteers, each one greeting him with a mix of curiosity and caution. He recognized some of the faces, people he'd dismissed in passing during patrols, people he'd assumed he knew. Now, they were no longer just figures in the shadows. They were people, each with their own struggles and stories, each one a reminder of how much he still had to learn. Throughout the evening, Ryan listened as Mrs. Warren shared stories of the neighborhood's resilience, the strength of its people, and the challenges they faced daily. He learned about families struggling to make ends meet, single mothers raising children on minimum wage jobs, teenagers fighting against a cycle of poverty and violence. Each story chipped away at the barriers he built, replacing his assumptions with understanding. By the time the event ended, Ryan felt a profound shift within him. For years, he had viewed his role as one of enforcement, of upholding order through fear and authority. But now he saw that true protection came from empathy, from knowing the people he served. As the crowd dispersed, Mrs. Warren approached him, her eyes warm but serious. "You've taken a step, Officer Steele, but the journey has only begun." He nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Thank you, Mrs. Warren, for giving me a chance." She returned the smile, her expression softened by a hint of pride. "Thank yourself for taking it." As he left the community center that night, Ryan felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He knew he still had a long way to go, but for the first time, he felt ready to walk that path, not as an officer enforcing rules, but as a person seeking to understand and serve. Redemption and change. Months passed, and Officer Ryan Steele's life looked nothing like it had before. Gone was the hard-edged cop who viewed his badge as a weapon of authority. In his place was a man grappling with a profound understanding that true power came not from instilling fear, but from fostering trust. After the night of the community event, Mrs. Warren had become an unexpected mentor to Ryan. She introduced him to the people he once regarded as shadows, names and faces he had previously dismissed in passing. Week after week, she invited him to sit with families, to listen to their stories, and to understand the complex struggles they faced. Under her guidance, he spent evenings at the community center, joining volunteer efforts, distributing food, and mentoring youth who had previously feared or resented the police. Yet, the transformation wasn't without its challenges. Ryan's initial reputation preceded him, and many were wary of his presence. He could feel their stares, the unease in their movements when he first arrived. It was as if they were waiting for him to reveal his true nature. But as time went on, he realized that his role wasn't just to be a protector. It was to earn their trust, something he now understood could only be given, never taken. One afternoon, Mrs. Warren called him into her office at the community center. She looked at him with the faintest smile, her eyes glinting with pride. "Ryan, I have a task for you," she said, holding out a folder filled with information about a local mentorship program. "There's a young man named Trey who's been in and out of trouble. He's smart, but he's got a lot of anger. Anger I recognize well. I think you might be able to reach him." Ryan nodded, understanding the responsibility in her words. He knew Trey by reputation, a teenager with a chip on his shoulder and a record of minor infractions. He was known for getting into fights and had once even tagged the precinct's outer wall with graffiti, a bold act of rebellion that Ryan would have met with punishment not long ago. Now he saw it differently, a call for attention, for someone to notice his struggles. The next day, Ryan met Trey in one of the small meeting rooms at the community center. Trey slouched in his chair, his arms crossed, a scowl fixed on his face. Ryan sensed the resentment, the guarded stance of a young man who'd been let down too many times. "So, you're the cop who's supposed to help me now?" Trey sneered, his tone laced with skepticism. Ryan held his gaze, refusing to respond with authority or defensiveness. "Not here as a cop, Trey. "Just as someone who wants to listen," he replied, his voice calm. "I used to think the badge meant I had all the answers, that it made me better. But I've learned a lot since then, and I realize that I have as much to learn from you as you do from me." Tree's eyes narrowed, studying him with a mixture of curiosity and doubt. "You don't know anything about me," he muttered, looking away. Ryan leaned forward, his tone gentle. "You're right, but I'd like to. And I don't expect you to believe that right away. I'll be here as long as you need me." The silence stretched between them, thick with tension, but something shifted in Trey's eyes, a flicker of openness, a crack in the hardened exterior. They spent the afternoon talking, Trey's guarded comments slowly giving way to glimpses of vulnerability, moments when he let his walls down just enough for Ryan to glimpse the pain and frustration underneath. Days turned into weeks, and Ryan's relationship with Trey grew, marked by small but significant victories. He listened as Trey recounted his struggles at school, his distrust of authority, his feeling of being labeled before he even had a chance to prove himself. Ryan shared his own journey, his own mistakes, and the ways he was working to make things right. Slowly, trust began to form, and Trey's anger softened, replaced by a budding sense of respect. One evening, after a particularly long conversation, Trey looked at Ryan, his expression hesitant. "You know," he said quietly, "I never thought I'd actually like a cop. But you're different. You actually listen." The words struck Ryan, filling him with a mixture of pride and humility. He knew that it wasn't about being a cop or not. It was about being a person who listened, who respected others without judgment. In that moment, he realized that his journey with Trey was a reflection of his journey with the community as a whole. But his efforts didn't go unnoticed back at the precinct. Captain Rice called him into her office one afternoon, her face serious yet tempered by a glimmer of approval. "Ryan, I've been hearing good things about your work in the community," she began, folding her hands on her desk. "What you're doing is rare, and frankly, it's exactly what we need more of in this department." Ryan nodded, a feeling of pride swelling in his chest. "Thank you, Captain. I've realized that my job isn't just about enforcing the law. It's about understanding, about being part of the community we serve." Reyes nodded, her expression softening. "I think this department could benefit from what you've learned, from the changes you've made. We're launching a new community outreach initiative, and I'd like you to lead it." The offer took Ryan by surprise, but it was one he welcomed with open arms. He had spent so much time repairing his own relationship with the community, and now he had a chance to help others within the force do the same. In the months that followed, Ryan became a bridge between the community and the precinct, organizing neighborhood meetings, speaking to local youth, and working with officers to shift their perspective on what it meant to serve and protect. Through these efforts, he saw the walls that once divided the precinct and the neighborhood begin to crumble, replaced by a fragile but growing trust. One evening, during a neighborhood event, Ryan spotted Mrs. Warren across the room, speaking to a group of residents. He made his way over, and she turned to him, a knowing smile lighting her face. "You've done good work, Ryan," she said, her voice filled with pride. "But remember, this journey doesn't have an end. There will always be challenges, always new people to reach." Ryan nodded, feeling the truth in her words. "Thank you, Mrs. Warren, for everything. I wouldn't be here without your guidance." Mrs. Warren's smile softened, and she placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "The credit is yours, Ryan. You chose to change. You chose to listen, and that makes all the difference." As the event continued, Ryan looked around the room, seeing faces that no longer regarded him with suspicion, but with acceptance, with trust. He knew that the journey was ongoing, that his work was far from complete, but for the first time, he felt at peace, grounded in a purpose greater than himself. He had learned that true authority came not from power or control, but from understanding, from humility, and from respect. And as he stood among the people he once viewed as strangers, he realized that he had finally found his place, not just as an officer, but as a part of the community he served. The ripple effect. Months after taking on his new role as head of the community outreach program, Ryan Steele found himself on the cusp of yet another transformation. Not his own, but that of the precinct and the wider community he'd once viewed with suspicion. While he had rebuilt his relationships and redefined his purpose, the journey was far from over. He now saw the ripples of his actions affecting other officers, and the challenges they encountered highlighted the work yet to be done. On a chilly autumn morning, Ryan stood outside the precinct's main entrance, watching as officers arrived for the day. Some of them nodded in greeting, others offered a quiet word of encouragement, but he noticed that a few still seemed skeptical, their eyes lingering with the same doubt he'd once held toward the community. He knew their hesitation well. It was the very thing that had fueled his own biases for so long. But now, he understood that changing perspectives required patience, just as it had taken Mrs. Warren's unwavering support to change his own. As he entered the building, he was greeted by Officer Jackson, whose approval he'd earned over the past year. Jackson offered him a warm smile, a gesture that was still novel but heartening. "Steele," he said, his voice full of encouragement, "how's the youth mentorship program coming along?" Ryan grinned. "Better than I expected. Trey, the kid I've been working with, just finished his first community project, a mural outside the center. It's his way of reclaiming the space he once vandalized." Jackson raised his eyebrows, nodding in approval. Impressive. A few officers could learn from that transformation. The words were not lost on Ryan. While he had made strides, he knew there were still members of the force resistant to change. His new initiatives had sparked curiosity and admiration among some officers, but others clung to outdated ideas, dismissing his work as soft or a waste of time. Today, he was set to lead a training session with these very officers, a workshop on community engagement that had sparked tension within the precinct. As the time for the workshop arrived, Ryan entered the briefing room, where a handful of officers were gathered, their expressions ranging from mild interest to outright disdain. He spotted Officer Nolan among them, a veteran cop with a reputation for being unyielding, his approach often clashing with the community-first values Ryan now championed. Ryan cleared his throat and began the session, sharing stories of the successes from the outreach program. Families who felt safer, youth who were choosing community service over crime, and businesses that now saw the precinct as a partner rather than a threat. But Nolan, leaning back in his chair with crossed arms, looked unimpressed. "What's the point, Steele?" Nolan challenged, his voice carrying the cynical edge. "We're not social workers. Our job is to enforce the law, not to play nice with people who break it." Ryan held Nolan's gaze, recognizing in him the very same mindset he had once harbored. "I get where you're coming from, Nolan. Believe me, I used to think the same way. But enforcing the law without understanding the people we serve creates a divide that only leads to more crime, more resentment. When people trust us, they work with us, not against us. It's about building respect." Nolan scoffed, shaking his head. "Respect? These people don't respect us, Steele. They only see us as the enemy." Ryan's patience was tested, but he remained calm. "That's because, for too long, we've acted as if they were the enemy. But they're not, Nolan. They're people with lives and families, struggling in ways we can't even imagine. I've seen the difference that understanding makes. It's the reason we're even having this conversation." As the session continued, Ryan shared stories of individuals he had come to know well, of Trey, the troubled teen whose life had turned around with guidance and support, of Mrs. Warren, who had bridged the gap between the precinct and the community with quiet strength and resilience, of the single mothers, the struggling families, the young entrepreneurs who now looked at the precinct as a place they could rely on rather than fear. Gradually, the room grew quiet, and even Nolan's rigid stance softened. While he didn't say much, his eyes reflected a hint of contemplation, as if Ryan's words had struck a chord. At the end of the session, as the officers filed out, Officer Nolan lingered behind, his expression conflicted. Finally, he spoke, his voice subdued. "You really think these people can change, Steele?" Ryan met his gaze, seeing both skepticism and hope in the older officer's eyes. "I don't just think they can, Nolan. I know they can. And it starts with us. People can't change if they're only ever seen as criminals or lost causes. We have to be the ones to break that cycle." Nolan said nothing more, but he nodded, a silent acknowledgement that Ryan's message had resonated, even if only slightly. And Ryan knew that was enough. Change didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, steady process, just like his own journey had been. A few weeks later, Ryan stood before a crowd gathered outside the community center. A mural stretched across the building's facade, painted in vibrant colors that depicted scenes of unity and strength. At its center was an image of Mrs. Warren, her expression serene but resolute, embodying the resilience of the neighborhood she had dedicated her life to uplifting. Trey stood beside Ryan, his face beaming with pride as he admired his own handiwork. As the ceremony began, Mrs. Warren stepped forward, addressing the crowd. "This mural represents the power of community, of people coming together despite differences, despite challenges," she said, her voice carrying a quiet authority that commanded respect. "It stands as a reminder that change is possible, that people, whether in uniforms or street clothes, can come together when there's mutual respect and understanding." Her words filled Ryan with a deep sense of gratitude. He had come full circle, from a man who saw his badge as a symbol of power to one who now viewed it as a responsibility, a commitment to serve with humility. As the crowd dispersed, Mrs. Warren approached him, her eyes twinkling with pride. "You've done well, Ryan," she said, resting a gentle hand on his shoulder. "But remember, this is only the beginning. Change is never a destination. It's a journey." He nodded, the truth of her words resonating deeply. "Thank you, Mrs. Warren, for believing in me when I didn't even believe in myself." She smiled, her face warm with understanding. "Sometimes, all it takes is a spark, and you've become that spark, Ryan. Now, it's your turn to keep the fire burning." As he walked away, Ryan felt a profound sense of purpose settle within him. The road ahead would be long, and there would be setbacks, but he was ready. He had learned that change, true change, was born from persistence, patience, and compassion. The mural, shining brightly against the evening sky, served as a beacon of that change, a symbol of the bridge he'd helped build between the precinct and the community. And as he looked back one last time, he knew that his journey was far from over. But for the first time, he felt that he was exactly where he was meant to be, not just as a cop, but as a man dedicated to serving others with honor, respect, and humility.